some people say that coaching is about the management of attention. It's a bit more than that, but it's a great starting point. So this definition, if you buy into this definition, it will help you to sort of understand what it is that we're going to be doing today. All right. So another starting point, why do we do what we do, and why do we often not do what we need to do so that we can be who we would love to be or have what we would love to have in our lives, depending on how we look at it. So a starting point to the starting point is you can basically say that we do what we do because of stuff that goes on in the brain just before we did it. So this is if you wish, the neurological starting point is that a second or so before we act, there is a salient sensory event which comes into a sense organ, or maybe a thought that comes up into the mind, and then that is picked up by the brain. It is interpreted by the brain. It then creates stuff going on, the stuff that happens in the brain, which then creates impulse, often born of emotion. The impulse leads to a choice. The choice leads then to action potentials in the brain, which then flow to the musculoskeletal system. And then you get actions, and then you get results or consequences of those actions. So that's pretty simple. And we can debate this, but it's just a kind of a somewhat superficial look at what's going on in the second or so before we take an action that is either skillful or maybe less skillful. And then sometime before a second before that, and you can sort of look at this the other way around, the universe started, evolution occurred, we created cultures, we were born into a family of origin, we have experiences, those experiences create storylines or narratives which get installed into us. Those may or may not have an impact on certain things that happen in the brain around such things as receptor density, speed of neurotransmitter uptake. We'll talk perhaps about some of those things a little bit later on. Hormones have a relationship with them, and all of that helps, which then feed in and add to these salient sensory events which are on the in the second before arena. Okay, that ultimately lead to results. So there's this whole soup of things that might be going on that lead to a specific behavior in relation to a particular context. And today we're going to just talk about the brain. So I want to have a little bit of fun with this. Now, it could be argued that the mind is the forerunner of everything that we do. And so this is somewhat non-controversial, that everything that we do originates in the mind. It starts with thoughts, possibly emotions, which are appraised by the mind, and then they lead to impulses and then actions. Many would say that the mind is what the brain does. So the extent to which you take that to be true depends upon your philosophy. But there is at least some truth, probably a good degree of truth in that statement, that the mind is what the brain does. Okay, so let's see how much you all know about the brain. So we've got a quite good number of participants. In the chat box, would anybody like to put in, or would you all like to put in, answered a couple of questions? How much do you think the brain weighs? Just chuck it into the chat box. Anybody got any ideas? Roughly, how much do you think the brain weighs? No one? Nobody wants to make an offer? No brave soul? 5 kilograms? If your brain weighs 5 kilograms, I'd love you to send me your resume and come and join my company. 5 pounds, 3 pounds, couple 100 grams, 3 kilos. All right. So the brain actually weighs around about 1.4, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 kilograms. So it does vary a bit. So it's about, say, an average of about 1.4 kilos. And how much, in terms of the percentage of our metabolic energy? So we've got this thing that is, say, a couple of kilograms, fractional percentage, a very, very small percentage of our total body weight. What percentage of our metabolic energy do you think it's using? What percentage of our glucose? So yeah, 20 to 25% is actually the correct answer. So it's a very interesting organ. There's clearly quite something going on in there. it's not moving around, but clearly if it's using so much metabolic energy, then what actually is going on inside this thing called the brain? Well, actually, what's happening in the brain all the time is the brain is creating electrical impulses. So if you look at this diagram, and I know this may seem a little bit basic to some of you, but those big blob, and this is a schematic, it doesn't really look like that at all. But those big blobs in the middle are the nuclei of these things called neurons, which are the cells that occupy much of the brain, called neurons. And you can see that there are these pulses that are traveling down neurons. They're going through the nucleus of the neuron. And then what's happening is they're causing that neuron to fire. And then it's sending electrical impulses to other neurons. And so these neurons are connecting together in myriad different ways that we'll just talk about a little bit later on. So if this is, here is a diagram of one of those neurons. And my question to you now is, how many of these do you think the average human has in their brain? How many neurons do you think the average human has in their brain? And a lot is not a good enough answer. I do get that one a lot. The answer is a lot, 3 billion. Okay, we've had an offer of 3 billion. Any others? 100 billion has come in, billions, or as Donald Trump would say, billions and billions and billions and billions. And the answer is around about 85 or so billion neurons is the amount that we have. And it's really interesting because a fruit fly has 100,000 of them, a mouse has 50 million, a monkey about 10 billion, and a human around about 85 billion neurons in our brain. That is a very, very large number. Okay. Now, so if you look at the interconnections between these neurons, and so if you think about the way that we experience things, so if you look at my finger, if I do this with my finger, the reason why I'm able to do this with my finger is because of patterns of electrical connections between neurons in various parts of my brain. There's a pattern of several 100,000 to several million neurons that will fire just around the intention to create that action. There'll be another pattern that will fire when I actually do the action. There might be a pattern that fires because of how I feel about doing the action, etc., etc., etc. So we learn through the creation of these connections between neurons. We do things because of firing of connections between neurons in certain particular patterns that correlate with, if you wish, a unit of experience, a unit of action, a unit of emotion, or a unit of intention. So if we've got 85 billion neurons, how many neurons can each neuron possibly connect to? So in other words, how many neurons could how many connections could there be between neurons and other neurons? How many neurons could one neuron connect to, maximum? Any ideas? Somebody asked me not to quote Donald Trump. I apologize for that. A few hundred. So it's a little bit more than that. Any other offers? How many neurons can one neuron possibly connect to? All right, I'll give you the answer. The answer is one neuron can connect to up to 10,000 other neurons, which basically means, if you work it out, that we have, so if you've got 10,000 possible connections from each neuron, then there are 85 billion to the power of 10,000 possible unique connections that we can make in our brains. It's no wonder that we're sometimes a little bit confused. And that number of unique possible connections, by the way, is more than the number of atoms in the universe. So some people say that the human brain has limitless capacity. In fact, it was worked out that if we had enough hands and legs and arms, we would be able to drive simultaneously every car on the planet at the same time. We would have enough mental capacity, and we would be able to learn potentially to drive every single car on the planet at the same time, if only we could unlock all of that potential that we have in our human brains. We do lose around about between, depending upon how much alcohol we drink, we're losing between 10 and 100,000 of those per day on average. And remember that the brain can and will grow new neurons. This has been discovered probably over the last 30 years. It used to be thought that you're kind of stuck when you're 21 and what you've got is all you're going to ever have. That is not necessarily true. The neurons are continuously firing, and they continuously make new connections. And we'll talk a little bit about that, obviously, a bit later. Okay, so that's happening. And by the way, if anybody's got any questions, just type them into the chat. And Sam, maybe you could monitor them, yeah, and see if anything is coming up by way of questions as we go. Yeah, Sam, are you there?
Sure. Yeah.
Good, thanks. All right, so here's an interesting graph which shows that, you know, after about the age of 20 or so, you can see that the brain actually gets smaller, and over time, from that level of around about 1.25 to 1.5 kilograms. And it kind of, it turns out that we lose around about 5% of our gray matter per decade after the age of 35. And it turns out that this, if you wish, atrophy of the brain particularly affects a structure called the prefrontal cortex. And that's potentially important because the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that is responsible for this thing called self-regulation. And so, but do know that most of it, so if we lose our mental faculties, it won't be because of this atrophying of the brain. Unless we happen to suffer from dementia or something like this, it would take at that rate around about 300 years before we would notice any significant drop off in brain function as a result of this natural atrophy. So if we lose our cognitive functioning as we get older, it's often not because of the fact that the brain is losing gray matter. It's more because of the fact that we're just not, we give up using our brain to its full intent, to its full extent. And we lose what we don't use in terms of the ability to use the brain in this way. It has been worked out, a seminal study by a lady called Sarah Lazar, I think that was published in 2007, and her team from Harvard and other places. They actually worked out that using mindfulness practice, this age-related decline in cortical thickness and grey matter density is actually reversible. And now this has become quite a well-known result of mindfulness practice. You can see there in this particular study how there was a fairly significant decline with age in a control group, and actually a slight increase with age in a group of mindfulness practitioners. And there's a lot of studies now that have been done since then that show this result. And the reason why is because of increases in thickness in some parts of the brain that are very, very important related to coaching, and also very, very important related to our ability to be if you wish, functional, happy and successful in our lives, impacting on places like the hippocampus, which is where emotional memories are integrated, various parts of the prefrontal cortex that relate to self-awareness and self-regulation, and also other parts of the brain which help us, to, if you wish, to remember our goals and bring our attention back to our goals. So again, we'll touch on some of these things in a moment. Our point of view is that coaching, if done well, is in fact similar to mindfulness training, as we'll see a little bit later on. Coaching is in fact an expression of mindfulness practice. And if it's done well, it cultivates the trait state of mindfulness within its clients, where mindfulness in this context really means the ability to notice when we're going off track and bring our attention back to the track. It's really that simple. Mindfulness is really about remembering an object of attention, which could be your goals, it could be your values, it could be how you want to show up, noticing when you've lost that object and gone somewhere else, and then simply being able to reorient your attention back to an object. And of course, this is really what is happening in coaching. We're helping a client to discover a very, very important object, i.e. a goal or a value that they would like to bring forth in their lives. Notice when they've gone off track, and to bring themselves back to the track. So there's that. Now, somebody I noticed earlier on did put the word neuroplasticity in the chat box. And we want to talk just a little bit about this topic. Can't go into it in much detail, but fundamentally, the full name for the word neuroplasticity is it's called experience-dependent neuroplasticity. And the reason why it's called experience-dependent neuroplasticity is because it's the idea that as we experience the world and as we act in the world, we respond to the world. And as we respond to the world, our brain changes. So when we learn something new, our brain changes in its shape and structure, and connections are made between various neurons that correlate with that learning. When we experience an emotion, there will be a firing pattern that correlates with that emotion. And then there'll be another firing pattern that correlates with what we do with that emotion. And this is all happening through the process of neuroplasticity. If we would like to change how we react to the world or how we respond to the world, then we would need to change the way that the wiring, the way that these firing patterns are actually working within our brains, so that we can create new firing patterns, which then create with new units of intention or experience or action or emotion or learning or whatever that may be. And the great news is that that many parts of the brain are extremely plastic, and other parts of the brain are less so. So let's just have a quick look at how neuroplasticity actually works in just a little bit more detail. And what I really want to do here is really just to help people to understand that these days we know that change, that fundamentally everything is up for grabs in the context of a person's ability to change. Even if you go back 40 years, it was thought that much of our personality was kind of baked in at the age of, say, 25. And it was kind of done, and nothing really much was going to happen after that. In fact, we used to have a saying in the UK, which was something like, if you show me the 7-year-old, I will show you the man. And we now know that that is patently not true, that anything that a person would like to change about themselves is doable, provided the individual has the will and the skill in order that they can make it happen. Okay, so how do these physical changes work? And there's a few ideas there. The first way is myelination of an axon. So you can see there that, I don't know if you can see where I'm putting my, can you see my cursor moving on the screen or not as I do that? Yeah, you can. So you can see here that there's this thing here which goes from the cell body of one neuron, and it connects potentially to other neurons. And this thing is called an axon. Those axons can actually be, they can be very, very short indeed, or they can be up to a couple of a meter or so in length, if they're going down into the gut or other parts of the body. And what happens when the cell fires from the nucleus of the cell, if that wiring pattern is not well defined, if it hasn't been used very often, then what will happen is the electrical current will leak as it travels down the axon. It will just leak out into the surrounding tissue. And neuroplasticity involves that every time that pattern fires, one of the things that happens is a layer of fat is put around the axon. It's called myelin, and that acts as an insulator. And so therefore, when it fires once, it's very, very weak. But if it fires again and again and again, it is more likely that that charge will actually reach the end of the axon and therefore get transmitted to the next neuron. And that is called myelination. And this is one of the ways that, and by the way, I'm trying to attend to people joining in the waiting room. So every now and then I have to take my eye off of the.
Don't worry, I'll do it, Tony.
Can you do that, Sam? Are you able to do that?
I've been doing it, yeah.
Lovely. So please do attend to that. So insulation of the electrical channel is one way that it that we learn, because as the insulation grows, then it's more easy for us to bring back that memory or take that action or pay attention in a certain way or experience a particular emotion. And there was a gentleman called Webb, and I can't remember what his first name was, but he first used the expression neurons that fire together, wire together. And what that really means is the more times a neuronal firing pattern occurs, the easier it is for that pattern to occur again. Okay, so another thing that happens is synaptic density increases. So down at the bottom here, there are these things called synapses, which are the little gaps across which the electrical impulses have to jump in order to cause the next neuron to fire. And the more the more synapses there are that are connecting two neurons together, the more likely it is that the electrical current can actually pass to the next neuron and cause that neuron to fire. Axon nodes are just amplifiers that you get down axons. They occur periodically on longer axons, and they just amplify the current. Dendrite growth. A dendrite is at the receiving end of a neuron here, are dendrites. So the axons connect to dendrites in other neurons, and they also grow out. And then you get new neuronal growth, which is where neurons are actually growing out and making connections at random to other neurons. We'll talk about that a bit later on. So this neuroplasticity is amplified by arousal. And that's why if we notice that when we're doing something, if there's an emotional charge, like we're either very much enjoying it or we're very much hating it, then it will cause that pattern to wire more tightly. Repetition obviously will cause the firing to create wiring, as will being carefully focused on the activity. Being really attentive to the activity will help the firing pattern to wire in more tightly so that we're more likely to be able to use it a little bit later on. Okay. So again, this is really just introductory material. And what it really speaks to is that the brain really likes to make these firing patterns, to make these connections. So anybody get any thought on why it is that we say that the brain is a connection-making machine? It really loves to make these mental maps. Any thoughts on why from anybody? What is the benefit to us of the fact that the brain is doing this all the time, the human brain? What's its survival benefit to us? Yeah. So yeah, it does. It allows us to learn, but perhaps more importantly, it allows us to keep this part of the brain, which is where we do all of our creative work, our analysis, our problem solving. The idea is to keep this area of the brain as clear as possible to receive new information. And this is really the basis of learning. It's the basis of creativity, having a quiet mind where things are packed away into deeper parts of the brain, particularly around the basal ganglia in the very, very deep areas of the brain, where all of our habits and patterns become resonant. And the brain really likes to create these patterns. It also, once the patterns have been formed, it's virtually effortless. Even a complicated task can become virtually effortless. So that we can free our mind up to attend to new data, new information that requires processing. So they're created very, very easily. We do have a few that are sort of hardwired at birth, but not as many as we think. We have an innate fear of snakes, for example. We have an innate fear of falling. But it's probably not any longer held to be true that personality traits are hardwired. They're easily, you do see tendencies, of course, in very, very young people, including young babies. But it turns out there's quite a lot of evidence that early environment will very, very quickly overwrite predispositions that are seen early on in life. the existing wiring, once it is created, it's quite durable. It's not easy to get rid of an existing tray that is there. It will potentially always be available to your mind. Old ways of doing things, old ways of thinking about things, old ways of generating emotions tend to be very, very durable, and will still be available to your mind under certain conditions, particularly stressful conditions. Um, the more stress that we are under, the more likely it is that we will revert back to an older pattern of behavior, um, even though we may have learned and to some extent embodied a new pattern of behavior. It's quite difficult to deconstruct old wiring. But the good news is that we can overwrite that old wiring with new wiring so that we build new neural highways which are wider, if you wish. Is one metaphor of looking at it. You know, whenever we have an embodied unconscious skill, you can say that it's like a neural highway of neurons connecting together effortlessly, in the way that I described before. When we learn new skills, for a while, it can be really uncomfortable because we've got to continue to notice that we might be going down the old highway and asking moment by moment, oh, where does this highway take me? And do I want to go there? Is it leading me off the edge of a cliff? And then we need to notice the exit sign coming. And then we need to drive off the highway down a road that might be a little bit unclear and indistinct for a while. And we need to be going through that process again and again and again until the new highway has become wide enough through continuous use. As I mentioned earlier on, you could say that every time you use that highway, it gets wider. And then eventually it becomes wider than the old pathway, so the mind sees it more easily. Okay, and we're then able to travel down it. Now, it is worth noting that when it comes to these mental maps that are created, or sometimes called neural associations or firing patterns, there are many, many different ways of describing these things, that it is easier to extend an existing map than it is to create a completely new one. So what does that mean for coaching? What does that mean for coaching? And the fact that existing mental maps and neural associations can be extended into new territory that is perhaps associated in some way with things that we know. But it's very, very difficult to create a completely new one. It creates stress. It is hard. And what does that mean for advice giving in coaching when we think about it that way? It means that when we just give people advice, we're using that, we're actually giving advice from the perspective of our own mental maps. And what we're really doing in the mind of the client is we're kind of trying to create a completely new mental map that may not connect with anything that they already have. That has to be processed through the prefrontal cortex area of the brain, which is the analytical part of the brain. And that is actually quite difficult. That part of the brain turns out to be quite inefficient, as opposed to the emotional part of the brain, which is where insights occur through the extension of existing mental maps. So insight tends to occur when maps connect together or when they are extended into an area where we have what we call a concern or something that we care about. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. All right, and this is the nature of the aha moment, is where there may be two independent mental maps dealing with maybe two slightly different areas of knowledge, and somehow those maps are connecting together, and a fairly significant emotional charge occurs, and new knowledge and experience is then created. And that's the process of insight. I'm hoping to be able to get to talk about that a little bit later on. Okay. So a lot of work by people, you've probably heard of Richard Biatzis. He's quite a famous psychologist and scientist. And I can't remember the guy's first name, Jack, but there was a wonderful set of research and literature review that was published in 2018, where they worked out that coaching is creating a number of durable changes in brain morphology and function, so that where, as coaches, we are really helping a client to change the structure and function of their brain so that the way that they want to show up in their lives is supported. Okay, so there's what's kind of going on, and that was the introductory material to this talk. Has anybody got any comment so far? Anybody would like to say? Yeah, I'm just going back through some of the more recent questions. Yeah, conserving energy by forming patterns, moving processing out of the prefrontal area, which is where it often is. It's quite true. Moving processing out of the prefrontal down into the limbic and then even deeper into the basal ganglia. Cognitive override is related to self-regulation. Okay. Yeah, strength-based coaching, fantastic, good. So let's take the first lens in terms of how we can look at this, which we would say is a very, very important lens indeed in coaching, and that is what's going on in the brain as we manage our attention. And I think you would all agree that to some extent, what we're doing with coaching is helping a client to manage their attention so that they can keep their attention where it needs to be in as many moments as possible in their lives. So what's actually all going on with respect to this thing called attentional management? I'm not quite sure what's gone wrong with this, but if you look at the left-hand side of this diagram, you will see that there is a very important structure called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. You don't need to remember these structures, but it's useful to remember that there are such structures that exist. And the dorsolateral is arguably the most important structure in the context of self-regulation in the brain, the DLPFC. So what does it do is, in a nutshell, the DLPFC is that structure that enables a person to, I'm going to maybe use this phrase, to do the right thing, where the right thing is actually the more difficult thing for them. So what I mean by the right thing, there's no moral judgment here. It's the right thing for them in the context of what it is, whatever it is that they have committed to doing. So in order to do the right thing, they need to focus on the right thing. And in order to focus on the right thing, where that is the more difficult thing for them to focus on, as it often is. So let's say you have a value of courage, but maybe something is happening where it's gone missing in action. And you've just forgotten that you have this value of courage and that you would love to be able to use it in this particular context. Maybe you have the skills of, let's say, negotiation or conflict management. You've been on a training course and you have the skill. You know how to do it. But suddenly your boss shouts at you, or maybe a client looks at you, in a sort of a perplexed way, and suddenly all those skills go missing in action. They're lost to the mind. It is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that allows you to hold your attention on a skill or a value, even though it may have gone, there is something else that is trying to pull your attention away from it. Normally a fear, an anxiety, or something like this, okay? So we say that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is that part of the brain that allows you to apply your focus at will on whatever it is that you would like to be able to focus on. And it is one of the most plastic areas in the brain. I think somebody asked earlier on, what are the more plastic areas and the less plastic areas in the brain? You could say that the entire prefrontal area of the brain is highly plastic. And the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is extremely plastic, and it's very, very trainable. It's not difficult for a person with practices to be able to train their attention. Okay. But we need to know what the practices are in order to be able to do that. And it's simply practicing with noticing that your attention has gone off track and bringing your attention back to being on track. It's that simple. Every time one does that, they're building another synapse, another connection inside that muscle called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Now, what will happen with nearly everybody, or I would say everybody, is that we go off track. And so if you go to the top of the diagram, we go off track, and we call this either the default mode network, or otherwise known as the autopilot. And you can see that it's a very noisy place when we're in that kind of mind-wandering autopilot mode. There are a lot of things going on in various different parts of the brain, and there are a lot of things going on that don't need to be going on in order for us to be able to get our tasks done. So we do need to be able to learn to become aware when the default mode network or the autopilot is kicked in and we've gone off down some habitual rut or neural highway into a direction that may not be useful to us relative to our goals. We need to be aware of that. And that's what's going on the right-hand side, where we then become aware of this wandering. And this is the domain of what's known as somatic self-awareness. So when we go off track, the thing that will help us to notice is if we can be really aware of what's going on in the body, because those signals from the body, they're actually telling us, and it's quite an interesting mechanism. Those signals that are in the body that tell us that we're either on track or off track are picked up by this green splodge here, which is the insular cortex, which is just under the prefrontal cortex on both sides of the brain. The insular cortex picks up signals from the body. And what then happens is another part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, which is sometimes known as the error processing center of the brain, or the pain center. That might fire up and say, oh, are we on track? You know, or it will hypothesize that we've gone off track. And it will send a little signal of discomfort. And it will cause us to ask the question, whoa, what am I supposed to be doing right now? Am I on track or not? And then what happens is another interesting area of the brain called the infraparietal junction is interrogated. And in there's a lot of stuff that happens in there, but one of the things that goes on in there is we're holding onto our goals, our values, the ways that we want to show up. That gets interrogated. Are we on track? And if the answer is yes, then that's lovely. We're probably not, by the way. If the default network has been kicked in, we've probably gone off track, unless our autopilot has been successfully reprogrammed to be in line with our goals, and that can also happen. But if it's not, then we'll have gone off track, and we need to use this circuitry in order to come back to track. And so what is it that is happening here? If we help people to focus, then we're helping them to increase, if you wish, the activity in their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And it's actually growing in size, as well as neuronal density. So there's that. If we are, when they've gone off into the autopilot area, then their mind is wandering. Now, that may not be such a bad thing, provided the autopilot has been, if you wish, correctly programmed. But of course, often it isn't. And so we go off track. We can reprogram the autopilot with great transformational coaching as well. And we might get onto that a little bit later on. And that's about shifting what's going on in two systems of the brain called the liking system and the wanting system of the brain. And then training awareness, which of course is part of what coaching is really meant to be all about, is helping a person to become aware or creating awareness so that they can then come back to whatever is the track. All right. Any questions? I've had a question here. Is the autopilot mode mainly processed in the limbic system? And the answer is actually yes. The autopilot is very much an emotional experience. And it's going on in the background actually all the time. And the dominant part really that in terms of how that shows up in our lives is when the ventromedial prefrontal cortex actually, which is like an honorary part of the limbic system. It's actually part of the prefrontal, but it acts as if it's part of the limbic system. And it's very, very active when we're sort of on this kind of emotional autopilot. So the answer is yes, it is a function of our emotions. Yes, you can get a recording, but you're going to have to ask for it. So if you want to get the recording, you'd have to send me an email and actually ask for it, and then we will send it to you. Yeah, so it's good. So somebody's asked a question about whether coaching can override the patterns that are revealed using trait assessment tools. And the answer is Yes, actually. Trays are highly, they're not as plastic. It depends on the tray, and it depends how deeply wired they are, and it depends on how early in our lives they actually went in. But fundamentally, all or most trays can be changed, provided it is important enough for the client to make the changes necessary, and provided they know how to do that, and provided they have the patience and the time and the discipline to make that happen. So yes, is the answer to that. We believe that fundamentally everything is changeable. Okay. Sam, maybe you can stick in, well, my email address will be up at the end, but if you want to put it in now so that anybody who wants to get a recording of this can send me a
Yeah,
note.
Tony, we'll send a follow-up email afterwards so people can just reply to that as well.
Okay. I'd like people to be a little bit more proactive than that, actually, but yeah, it's fine. I like people to do a bit of work if they want to get the recordings. All right, so that's lens one, which is really about managing attention. All right. What about lens two? We look at the power of the subconscious mind and how the subconscious might impact on behavior. And I'm sorry if this seems a little bit dense or heavy for you. It's kind of difficult to, given that we've only got an hour to get through what is a somewhat difficult and dense topic. I have to do most of the talking, sadly. Otherwise, you're not going to learn anything. So, but please do feel free to continue to get your questions in. I do not know much about nootropics. I just don't know very much about them, Paul, I'm afraid. If you could let me know, maybe I do know what they are, but maybe the words that you're using may not be the words that I'm familiar with. If you're talking about psychedelics and things like that, please say so. I do have a point of view on those. Lens two, the power of the subconscious mind. All right, so again, it is related to attentional management, but it's about what is it that we're attending to? You know, are we attending moment by moment to our developmental goals, or are we instead attending to stuff that might be coming up from the subconscious mind? And if we are attending to stuff that might be coming up from the subconscious, can coaching intervene in any way so that we can better attend to our developmental goals and better have our developmental goals become embodied so that they then drop into the subconscious mind? All right. So what we know about the conscious mind is that it's pretty limited. And you can see here that we believe, I think it is generally held that in our conscious mind, we can only focus on one process at one time. Anybody got any objection to that idea that consciously we can only focus on one mental process at one time? If you've got anything to ask about that, put something in the chat or just open up your mic and object or do whatever you like about that, because we sometimes do get quite some debate about this topic. Okay, we can multitask. Moto, would you like to say something about how we can multitask? Conventional wisdom is that we cannot consciously multitask. We can switch tasks, we can switch between tasks, and we can do that quite frequently, although it does use a huge amount of energy when we do it. But conscious multitasking doesn't happen. Hands up if you have ever tried to listen to two conversations at one time. Hands up if you've ever tried to send a text message while having a conversation with someone. There's a whole website devoted to embarrassing text messages that have been sent by people doing that. It is generally regarded as being impossible. What we can do, we can, with our subconscious mind, let's say, for example, I can walk and breathe and eat a sandwich and have a conversation all at the same time, because most of those processes are being actually executed by the subconscious mind. They are embodied. I know how to walk without even thinking about it. I know how to breathe without even thinking about it. I might need to think about the conversation, but if I have to think about the conversation at the same time as, let's say, excuse me, let's say something's happening on the sidewalk ahead of me and I can't use it anymore, and I'm having let's say an important conversation on the phone, let's say with a client or someone, I would probably either have to ask the client that, if I could call them back after I've navigated the obstacle, or I would just have to stop. So we can do millions and millions and millions of things at the same time, as long as it's all embodied. In other words, we are unconsciously skilled at it, and we don't have to pay conscious attention to it. I can drive and talk and speak at the same time. But if I cannot pay conscious attention to more than one thing at one time, and nobody can, and we cannot train to be able to do that. It is impossible. Doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. There is some evidence that women are actually better at sequencing all of the various different inputs that come to them, whereas men are less capable and try to solve everything all at one time, which creates a huge amount of stress. And there's some evidence that women are a little bit better at sequencing the information, so they become less stressed by the overwhelm. So, nobody on the planet can actually focus on more than one stream of activity at one time. All right, so one mental process at once. So in the conscious mind, it would be good if we can continuously hold the benefits, the actions, the skills, the resources necessary so that we can move towards what we call, in our method, our well-formed goal. The WFG stands for well-formed goal. And that's a rational process, this bringing to mind again and again and again of what it is that we need to do when that is unfamiliar. That's a conscious, rational process. But sadly, for most of us, as we're trying to change, we are hijacked by our subconscious mind, which is full of, oh my God, what's going to happen if this happens? So we do a lot of this kind of what if processing oriented to the negative in our subconscious mind, because that's what kept us alive 15,000 years ago when we were living in the savannah or wherever we were at that time. Fears, and notice that I put F.E.A.R because it's meant to be an acronym standing for false expectations or predictions that appear to us to be real. And that's what's going on all the time, moment by moment, in the subconscious mind. We're taking in data from our senses in the present moment, taking it in, and we're automatically adding it to all of these things in what's known as implicit memory, memories that we don't know that we have. And we're using that information in the present, we're chucking it out into the future to make a prediction about what this moment means to my ability to survive in the future. And if the answer comes back that it's increasing my ability to survive and thrive in the future, then a sense of well-being is generated. And if the answer comes back that this is going to be meaningful for me on the negative side, then we generate what's known as a negative emotion, negative effect, or maybe an afflictive emotion. So that's what's going on. And this is unfortunately, the subconscious mind has a very, very significant, for most of us, negativity bias. Because the prime directive of the subconscious mind has always been to keep us breathing, to keep us alive. It's much less oriented to reward than it is oriented to keeping us alive. And so it gets a big tick in the box by just doing what it's always done, driving us to do what it has always done, what we have always done, because in theory, what we have always done has kept us alive by definition. So, and we say that if you do what you always did, you're going to get what you always got. And sadly, the subconscious mind will drive us in the direction of doing what we always did. Okay, so there's that. So about coaching. So the net impact of this is, for most of us, it appears unsafe to change. Okay, there's all this stuff that's coming up from the emotional system. And we know that the emotional system is much more powerful than the rational system in terms of its ability to drive behavior. Okay. Yeah. So there's that, and that's a very, very good point. When we have PowerPoints, with somebody said here that listening and reading are not possible. And so if we have over wordy PowerPoints with a lot of material on them and we're trying to read them, then we can't listen at the same time. And that is very, very true. Of course, a big challenge for all of us in the game of training and coaching. So what we can do, obviously, apart from attentional management, as we described earlier on, excuse me, what we can do is we can also, with coaching, we can work on our aspirations, we can work on our values, we can work on our goals, our strengths, skills, knowledge, experience, self-efficacy. So if we're able to install all of these areas into our subconscious mind through aspiration practices, visualization practices, challenging thinking, Socratic questioning, all of those things that that great coaches are doing. The reason why those things work is because we're helping a client to reprogram their subconscious mind so that their subconscious becomes aligned with what it is that they're trying to accomplish. And that's a very, very nice thing to be able to do. All right, so excuse me. Any questions on this so far? Let me see, where are we with time? We've got about 15 minutes left. Not long. All right. I'm not going to go into looking at such things as magic mushrooms and psychedelic drugs right now. Neither am I going to go into hypnotherapy at this point, although there's no doubt that psychedelics, hypnotherapy can have certain impact on the way the subconscious mind is working. But it's slightly off the scope of this particular topic and can easily take up the rest of our time. So I'm just going to leave it. If anybody would like to talk to me about that, we can talk offline. Let's talk about the third lens, which is calming the fight, flight, and freeze response, which of course is a very, very important part of coaching, and particularly evidence-based coaching. And so we know that one of the things that we need to do as coaches is to really help a client to de-stress, to be calm, to be in what we call a psychologically resourceful, psychologically flexible state of being. And unfortunately, that is not the default state of the modern human. There is a huge amount of research that shows that modern life actually puts people in a state of chronic sympathetic nervous system arousal. So the sympathetic nervous system is fundamentally you could say it's the fight-flight system. And it's the opposite of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is sometimes known as the rest and digest system, or the system of well-being. Sympathetic nervous system gets activated when we perceive that something emotionally salient or stressful has appeared in our world. And for many of us, we have this kind of chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system because we are making continuous negative appraisals of things coming into our senses. And it becomes a habit. And we don't even notice that we don't even notice that we're stressed, even though we are. So many of us, if we go to the doctors and have let's say a test for a protein called C-reactive protein, many of us will have elevated levels of C-reactive protein, which is one of the best stress markers that there is out there. And that fundamentally indicates that we have chronic activation. C-reactive protein actually is an inflammatory marker, but inflammation is most often caused by stress. That's quite interesting. And that's why it's related to stress. So C-reactive protein is the marker. I'll spell it out a little bit later on, or send me an email and I'll send you an article on it if you're interested. So the sympathetic nervous system activates when we are noticing that there is a stressor. So a stressor is something that is causing stress for us. And it drives a survival response, which is known as the fight, flight, or freeze response. And sometimes it's known as the accelerator pedal. Now, the thing to know about stress is that when we are stressed, it's not a useful state for most of us to be in. There is a kind of stress which is known as eustress, which is good stress, which is a type of stress that is associated with a positive emotional experience. It's the type of stress that we feel when we believe that we have the resources to meet a challenge. Okay, so if we are given a challenge, but we believe that we have or can find the resources to meet that challenge, and we would like to do so, then that puts us into a state of eustress, which is good stress, and it can move you into a flow state. On the other hand, if a challenge is coming to you and you do not believe that you have the resources to meet that challenge, and remember I say believe, as opposed to, because when we're under stress, our perceived resources often go missing in action at the same time as we big up the nature of the challenge. So it is a little bit of a web. We often overestimate challenges, we underestimate resources. And the third thing that we tend to overestimate, especially if we can't meet the challenge, if we don't believe we can meet the challenge, we overestimate the impact to us on the negative side of not being able to meet the challenge. And that adds up to what's known as distress. Okay, we have a demand, we've often overestimated. We have resources, we've underestimated it. We believe that we're going to die alone and poor if we're not going to be able to meet that challenge. And so we become psychologically distressed. And this is not a good thing. It is never good to be in a state of psychological distress. And what we need to be able to do is to help a client to become resourceful, which is to notice the storylines of bigging up the demand, minimizing the rewards, bigging up the impacts of not being able to meet the demand, noticing the storylines that might be running their mind that are creating psychological distress for them. And sometimes just a moment of pause can be, and helping a client to actually come back to the present moment can be enough for them to see the fake news within their own storylines. To use another somewhat unfortunate Trump quote. So what we need to do is to help the client. Sometimes we say we need to help a client to bring their parasympathetic nervous system, which is the other arm of the autonomic nervous system, the other arm from the sympathetic, bring the parasympathetic nervous system online so that they can come back to their resources. So psychologists, so whereas the sympathetic nervous system often moves clients into what's known as a threat state, the parasympathetic nervous system, when brought online, and it can be very easy to do, just taking a few deep, long out breaths, puts pressure on the vagus nerve around the heart region. And when we put pressure on the vagus nerve, it actually activates the parasympathetic nervous system to just give us a little bit more access to our resources, a little sense of perhaps perspective there. Okay, so that's what's happening here. And what we need to do, really, what we need to help clients to do is really just to bring their prefrontal cortex back online so that the parasympathetic can be activated, so that they can begin to regulate bottom-up subconscious storylines that are creating distress, to notice how true they are, to notice the resources that they have that they've probably forgotten about, and to see reality as it actually really is. And when we're able to do that, if we can't do that, then we are going not to be resourceful. We're not going to be able to create different ways of looking at things. We're not going to be able to create new connections which are positive, and contemplate different ways of doing things. Okay, so that's the fight-flight system. And of course, when we're actually in coaching, we need to do everything that we can to avoid a client getting sympathetically activated, to activating their sympathetic nervous system. And the easiest way that a coach can activate the sympathetic nervous system is to do what many coaches do, which is to ask more and more questions about the client drama. The more that a client asks questions about, the more that the coach asks questions about the client's drama, rather than the way that they are thinking and feeling about their drama, the more they're going to, trigger these emotional responses. There's a little bit of noise. If everybody could make sure that they're muted if they don't want to speak, that would be great. I don't think it's coming from here, but I will shut my door just in case. All right. So if we ask questions which are forward-looking towards goals, towards aspirations, rather than towards problems, then we're helping our client to activate their parasympathetic nervous system. And that is really where we would like to go with our clients, if possible. Okay, so there's that. Now, 38, got a couple of minutes left. We're not going to get into insight, but I do want to quickly talk about the differences neurologically in terms of coaching towards goals and aspirations as against coaching away from problems and dramas. So this comes from the work of Beatrice and Jack, this idea, and it's becoming less and less controversial. And by the way, here, in terms of what does NEA stand for? So NEA stands for negative emotional attractor, and PEA stands for positive emotional contractor. And many coaches actually do coach really around problems rather than around aspirations and goals. And they call this coaching for compliance, whereas coaching for aspirations and goals and connections, they call it coaching for compassion. And I think it's a very, very interesting way of looking at things. Okay, so just bear with me for 1 second while I get rid of all this noise. Here we go. All right. So let's have a quick look at what's happening from a neurological point of view when we coach towards positive emotional attractors. So the first thing is that you've probably heard of the dopamine reward system. And that is sort of mediated through a couple of places many, many places in the brain. It's the place in the midbrain called the ventral striatum that is involved, and also a very important structure, again, just under the sides here, called the nucleus accumbens. And high levels of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens creates a state of reward or well-being or drive. And what dopamine does, it's really interesting what dopamine does is when dopamine levels are high, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is more active when we are attending to whatever it is that we're attending to. So when dopamine levels are high, you could say that attention is fixed on whatever it is that is in our attention at the time that those dopamine levels are high. So you could say that that dopamine, you could say, is the gateway to new information coming into our awareness. If dopamine levels are low, we're looking for shiny objects to pay attention to. And if dopamine levels are high or rising, our attention remains in one place. And then we are driven to pursue whatever it is that we're attending to. So it turns out that if we can help a person to visualize their goals, including such questions as, well, what's it going to feel like for you and for others, as you move on this path towards your goals? Or so if you have a value of courage, what does it feel like for you when courage is alive within you? When courage is speaking to you, when it's active within you, what behaviors are being created then? And what does it feel like? And what is it like for others? So getting all around what we call the ecology of the goal or the aspiration and forming a strong visualization. begins to reprogram this motivational autopilot and perhaps begins to rewire all of these fears and anxieties that prevent us from moving down the path, right, towards our goals and aspirations. So very, very useful how coaching can work on these pathways. The amygdala involvement is interesting because often people think of the amygdala as creating only negative emotions, but it's not the case. The amygdala really is more the emotional sentinel, and is activated when the if you wish, the mind tells us, maybe the subconscious mind says, hey, there's something to pay attention to here. But that something could equally be something that we want rather than only something that we don't want. But it's a different part of the amygdala that's involved in there. The other thing is that when we help people working towards aspirations and goals, we find that their visual cortices are also more active. It is easier for them, therefore, to visualize the outcomes that they're looking for because of the neuroplasticity of that part of the brain. And we know that if we can create a vision of our future, like an image or a metaphor or even an emotion of something that's out there in the future, it's more durable in the context of us being able to hold it in our attention. And we don't even have to put language onto it. We just create the image, it creates the emotion, and off we go. So again, that's very, very useful. Another thing that happens when we coach towards positive emotional attractors is that it turns out that we have a left-sided asymmetry in terms of the development of the prefrontal cortex. And it's interesting that if there is this left asymmetry in the prefrontal cortex, then this is correlated with a state of psychological well-being or liking. So it's the liking response. We like it. If we like something and when we feel good about it, it turns out that the left prefrontal cortex is more active than the right prefrontal cortex. And if the right prefrontal cortex is more active than the left, then that is correlated with negative emotions that push us away from things. So again, it's useful to help our clients really to completely focus on, somebody asked earlier on, what is a question, what might be a question that gets somebody more embedded into their drama? So very, very easy. A typical one might be where a person comes in and spends 5 minutes downloading about what a terrible boss they've got and how badly they've been treated by their boss in that last few days. And the coach might ask, well, tell me more about that. Or maybe the coach didn't understand something about what was the content of the download and then asks questions so that the coach can clarify their understanding, forgetting that it's not, maybe the coach forgets in that moment that whether they understand the client's drama or not is actually irrelevant. What the coach really would like to do, ideally, is to help the client to understand how the way that they are thinking and feeling about their drama might be inhibiting them from moving towards their goals and aspirations. We're very, very likely to do this. And we need to help our clients to notice when they're doing it and then what they might be able to do about it in the moment. So the final thing here is the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. And which I mentioned earlier on, that when we move clients into thinking about it's interesting. So, for example, if you've got a client and they're dumping some story of drama onto you, there's often, they're often leaning forward, their face may be scrunched up, their voice might be quite excitable. And then you just ask the simple question, okay, so in the middle of this problem that you have, I understand that, thank you for sharing it with me. And in the middle of this, what is it that you would like to have happen? And that often just creates a little bit of a jolt. They sit upright, they become present, their face unscrews, and they move into a completely different state of consciousness. When you ask the question, okay, so you've got this problem, thank you for sharing it. And what is it that you want to have happen? I love the word have because it implies agency, rather than, well, I actually want my boss to leave. Okay, well, that, maybe you don't have much influence on that. But what is it that you can have happen, or what is it that you can cause? What is it that you would like to make happen in the middle of that drama? And then when you do all of these things, the net impact of all of this is that we scan for possibility. Your clients will begin scanning for possibility rather than just noticing limitation. And it also facilitates their ability, not only with you, but it helps them to wire in the capacity for better attunement with other people. All right. So you know what? There is lens 5, which is the conditions for insight, but I'm actually going to stop right now because we've kind of run out of time and I want to respect your time. And I would like to take any questions. So if anybody would like to open up the mic, if anybody wants to know about insights, then let me see. Well, what I'll do about the insight piece is I'll record it onto the video, and if anybody wants to watch that, then they'll see it on the recording. Okay. But in the meantime, questions. Yeah, so a couple of comments on rest and digest, and so it's a very interesting. When we are in this state of rest and digest, which means that we are emotionally unactivated, we're not sensing threat in our world. This is an extremely resourceful state for many of us to be in. We often see things completely differently when we are not perceiving threat in our existence coming to us. And we need to help people see that they do tend to overestimate the nature of the threats that they are faced with. The reality is that for most of us, that we are not under our emotions. So the sympathetic nervous system is designed to keep us alive. It's designed to get us out of immediate danger, and it creates emotions that are designed to get us up a tree, away from something that might be attacking us. The sympathetic nervous system is not really designed to deal with things that are longer than about 5 minutes in duration. So most threats that the sympathetic nervous system was originally designed by evolution to do are transient threats. There's a lion there, get out of the way or you're going to get eaten. As opposed to, why does he think, why doesn't he like me? In the wild, we didn't spend time ruminating on such things as guilt and shame and why does this person not like me, or whatever it might be that we do tend to do today. What happens if I don't get promoted, etc., etc. So we do have at least, so somebody might send you an email and it causes an immediate emotional response, and you'll see this a lot in coaching, an immediate emotional response that causes an impulse to type an instinctive response. And you're telling yourself as you press the send button, you're quite often beginning to tell yourself, maybe I shouldn't do this, maybe I shouldn't do this, but you can't stop yourself and off it goes. And then it requires cleanup. But the threats that we're under are not those kind of threats. We do have at least a couple of minutes where we can actually just stop, take a pause, challenge what the mind is actually telling us, ask if there's any fake news there that we're telling ourselves about the nature of the threat, the nature of our demand, the nature of our self-efficacy, the fact that we've been here before and we've been through it and we're still alive and breathing and maybe got a good job and perhaps somebody who loves us if we're lucky, and we can maybe half a step back from this threat and deal with it more skillfully. And just doing that, as soon as we actually ask ourselves, hold on a minute, what's going on with me right now? Why is it that I am reacting like this to that? That is a mindfulness practice. Yeah. And we are very, very likely with just that question to be able to bring our senses back online and see things as they actually are, rather than as the predicting brain is telling us that they are. Okay. All right. Yeah. So somebody said quite right. It is true that there are times when we need to ask questions about problems, um, uh, but not normally as much. Number one, not as much as we do, and number two, at the right time. Of course, we would. There's going to come a point when we've got the goals out, we've got the aspirations nailed. Of course, we're going to ask, okay, so what's getting in the way of all of this right now? What's happening instead of what you want right now? And then what are the storylines that are driving what is happening right now? And what is it that we might be able to do about those storylines? Absolutely. But we need to have anchored the prize first before we do that. And many coaches, they go straight in to getting more and more information about a problem. And that is not really helping a client to be resourceful when we do that. So yes, it is true, Mayi, that we need to get into the problems at the right time, and we shouldn't be dwelling on them as much as we do. We should always, as much as we can, help a client to move towards something that can be different. And if they've got a problem, we need to ask the question instead of getting more and more into the problem. A better question might be something like, and what is it that makes that a problem for you? For you. And then exploring that, because that will be where the storylines are resident, the subconscious emotional stories that are they're running in the subconscious, and we need to help the client to make them conscious so that they can see them and then potentially work with them. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Um, if not, then what I'll do is I'll offer you, if anybody would like to stay on, I'll offer you the insight piece, if you like. Won't take long. Got thumbs up coming in. All right. So how many do we have? Wow, 49. All right. So I'll just quickly cover this insight piece because it is, it is really what coaching is all about, isn't it? It's what we're really doing as coaches is creating the conditions for insight to occur. So how can we better do that, and what is happening around insight? And this, on our training, we spend probably about 2 hours just on insight. How can we create the conditions for insight within coaching, and perhaps what sort of questions might we ask that can create these conditions? But here's an interesting thing to know about creating the conditions for insight. Let me ask you this question. Maybe I'll chuck it out there. What do you think is the one thing that we can do as coaches to create the conditions for insight to happen within our clients? There's probably one thing that is above all else that we can do in order to create those conditions. Anyone? Anyone want to open up the mic? Or Sergio said asking the right questions. Maybe that certainly helps, but maybe there's something else that's got nothing to do with asking questions. Yeah, of course, the trust is right. We need to have, if the client's in a slightly threatened state because they don't trust you implicitly, then that's not going to help, obviously, because insight occurs in the absence of threat more easily. Teaching them to think for themselves, being present, actual listening. I love that, actual listening. Listening, holding open the space. So here's thank you for all of those offerings. So here's a diagram that might point to this a little bit. It's actually a graph. So here is what is going on within a person around the time of insight. So if you look at the R, the yellow R, and this is what's happening in the brain, by the way, of a person around the time of insight. So this yellow R is the moment at which a sort of an aha moves into the conscious awareness of a person. So it's the moment when they notice that they're having an insight. It might be that you could call it the aha moment. And at that moment, what you can see is that there has been a surge or a spike in what's known as gamma band signaling from the brain. So gamma waves, has anybody ever heard of this business of alpha, beta, gamma, theta, delta waves from the brain? So there are various different rhythmic patterns of firing of neurons in the brain that occur depending upon our state of consciousness. And the two that are relevant, really most relevant for insight and also very relevant for coaching, are the alpha band and the gamma band. And the alpha band is associated with a very, very quiet, almost meditative state of mind. It's not an empty mind, but it's a quiet mind. It's a mind which is calm and non-reactive. It's a mind that is stable. It's not jumpy. It's not excitable, and that's known as an alpha state. And it's a very slow, synchronous. It's about 20 cycles per second, about 20 firings per second, quite synchronous, and it's correlated with a state of well-being as well. So that's the alpha state. And what you can see is that for a while before the moment of insight, there is a period where there is this very high gamma signal that is emanating from the brain. And this is using 227 electrodes bolted on, stuck onto to a shaved head. That's how that works. And you can see these patterns. And so you have this period of quiet-minded, almost meditative state that occurs before about somewhere between a second and half a second before. Sorry, it's a couple of seconds, and sometimes a few seconds before the insight comes into conscious awareness. And what happens is around about half a second to 0.75 seconds before the insight becomes conscious, this alpha effect drops off. It drops through the floor. And what happens instead is a very, very energetic, very fast synchronous firing called the gamma band firing. And that works at about 60 per second. So it's 3 times as fast as the alpha band. And it starts up about half a second before the insight comes into conscious awareness. And this, in that half a second, a lot of other things happen. So you're not yet conscious of the insight that is happening, but your palms get sweaty, your body temperature goes up, your heart rate increases a little bit, and there is the beginning of an emotional response that's correlated with the surprise response. And yet, consciously, we have no awareness of it at all, but it's all happening at the level of the subconscious. And then that spikes, and then we have the moment of aha between 0.5 and 1 second later, and then it all floods into conscious awareness. And that's very, very interesting, because we need to do something with that. We need to firstly notice it. That will be noticeable. So when a client has an aha moment, which is associated with this gamma spike, that gamma spike is associated with a lot of somatic observable phenomena. You might see skin flushing. You might see a person sitting upright. They often will. If they're slouching, they'll sit up. They become present. Their voice might become very excitable. And we need to notice that and reflect back. What's the kind of question that we can ask a client when we notice the somatic correlate of an insight? What might be some questions that we can ask our client when we notice that, or we suspect? We won't know, of course, right? All we can do is observe something in the somatic field, or maybe through their tone of voice, facial expressions, pupils dilating perhaps, or skin flushing, or sitting upright, or clenching their fist, or what. What's going on yeah, what you could ask, it's a bit dramatic, a bit kind of, what's going on? But yeah, anything else? Yeah. What happened right now? Yeah, yes, I like that one, that Sandra. I just noticed this. So you share what you observed without any mental projection from your own mind. I noticed that you sat upright. I noticed that you clenched your fists. I noticed that I noticed that there was a change in your facial expression. What did you notice? And what are you doing when you What are you doing when you ask a question like that, actually? It's like oh, that did it on its own. I didn't touch that. What you're doing is you're basically bringing the client into the present moment where all learning occurs. All learning occurs in the present moment. All learning occurs through this moment of reflection on our experience, on what is happening right now. Yeah, you can ask the question, how are you feeling right now? As Sergio mentioned. I really like the question that Sandra offered, which is, what happened just then? Just simple, and let them tell you whether it was a feeling or a thought or whatever it might be. Let the client do that, rather than offering anything from your own map of the world about how you experienced it. Yeah. So that's in terms of what is it that the coach can best of all do in order to help to create the conditions for insight, is to leave a lot of silence and allow the client to reflect. Allow the client to reflect. And maybe just occasionally ask the question, okay, so I can, if there's a lot of reflection, then you can actually ask, so what is it that you're reflecting on right now? If you notice I'm writing stuff down, and they might, so what is it that you wrote just now? And all of this, because it's moving the client away from reflecting on their drama. When we don't reflect on our dramas, our mind will naturally quiet down. Don't step on the silence. Yeah, that's right. Silence is golden in coaching, of course, and you all know this if you're coaches, many of you. But there's a very strong neurological basis for it, because when we step on the silence of our client, we're giving them a little stress, a little vibration of parasympathetic nervous system activation, giving a little vibration of stress, and moving them away from being optimally resourceful, which is where you want them to be. So again, there's a lot to say on insight, and here is the final slide of our presentation. And my PowerPoint is doing stuff on its own. I'm feeling really stressed now about that. So there you go. So this rush of insight that is there, there's a few things to know about it. It is if a client has had an insight, the thing that is at the bottom of this slide is very, very important. It is important to do something with a client insight. For a while, they may be quite disrupted by the insight, but even if they are, the question, if you're not questioning around that insight and asking them what they want, what they themselves might want to do with that insight, it will fall away as if they've been dreaming within a few minutes. It might be forgotten very, very quickly. Insights that are not kind of wired in and sat with for a while, we sometimes call it sitting with the good. And that comes from a gentleman called Rick Hanson. In his book, Hardwiring Happiness, he talks about sitting with the good stuff, because negative stuff that happens in our life will stick very, very quickly and remain with us forever. But the good stuff, including insights that we might have while we're driving or while we're in coaching or wherever it might be, if we don't bring attention to them and expand them and visualize a sensory experience around them, we'll quite often forget that we won't forget that we've had the insight, but we might forget what the insight was. And there's nothing more frustrating. I wonder if it's ever happened to any of you, that you've had an insight about something, but you can't remember what it is. Is that ever? Yes. And how does that feel? It's awful. You've had something and you knew that it was important, and you can't remember what it is because you weren't able to write it down, or you weren't able, for whatever reason, to pay real attention to it with proper attention density in the moment. And it goes. So remember, if you notice the client has had an insight, build around it. Ask them if they want to go somewhere with it. If they don't, then fine, move on. But if they do, then put some richness in it. Ask them to visualize what it is, what needs to happen with it, and what will happen when that happens. Yeah. So that's it. That's about it, and I'll leave you my email address there just in case anybody wants anything about anything around this stuff. We do run occasional what we call programs, like we used to call them cluster programs, specifically around things like how to create well-formed goals. We don't care if you were a Transcend trainee or not. You're most welcome to come to some of the advanced topics that we offer when they come up. We had one recently around well-formed values that was actually good. Sometimes you have to pay for them. Sometimes they're free of charge. But if you want to know about these things, then send me an email and we'll let you know about them. Any questions? Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, any questions? Any feedback, good or bad? It's all good for us. And of course, we would love to see you at one of our trainings or at one of our events. Keep in touch with us. And if you don't have any questions, I think I'll just say goodbye to everybody then. Have a lovely evening.
Left you.
Huh?
Thank you very much. It was fantastic. It was very interesting.
Thanks, Jajian. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye now.
Somebody's waving at me. Thank you. Bye-bye now.